He collapsed barefoot on the frozen street, and the whole crowd turned away. Not a word, not a hand, just silence. But then a small boy stepped forward and offered him a piece of bread. That single act of kindness would matter more than anyone could imagine, uncovering a truth no one in Rivertown ever expected. This is not only a story about poverty on a winter night. It is about a woman who carried 50 years of strength, a boy who believed in compassion, and the old man whose forgotten past would change their lives forever. If you were there, would you have stopped to help, or would you have walked away? Share your feelings in the comments below, because your voice matters. Thank you for listening, and may your day be filled with kindness and courage. Morning in Rivertown came without splendor, just a slow gray light pressing against cracked windows and peeling paint. The town stirred itself awake with the groan of old buses and the shuffle of boots on uneven sidewalks, and the air carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Houses leaned tiredly against one another, storefronts showed signs long faded by sun and neglect, and the streets echoed more with silence than conversation. In this forgotten place, where people measured worth in glances and whispers, Clara stepped out with her nephew, as she did every day, carrying both groceries lists and the weight of judgment. Clara was 50 years old, her dark skin warm as polished wood, her posture straight though her shoulders bore the years heavily. Her hair, short and tightly curled, was wrapped beneath a scarf once burgundy but now dulled to the color of old wine, and her coat, patched neatly at the elbows, hung heavy against the wind. She had eyes that spoke of fatigue but also of stubborn dignity, eyes that had learned to keep steady even when stares around her burned sharp. Since her sister's passing, Clara had raised Eli, and though the task bent her back and emptied her purse, she carried it without complaint. To the town, however, she remained an unwelcome reminder of hardship. A woman, some whispered, dragged her block down simply by existing. Eli was 12, lanky but not yet grown, with skin lighter than Clara's and eyes quick with curiosity. His hair refused to stay flat, curling at the crown no matter how often he pushed it down with his palm, and his favorite hoodie hung too loose at the sleeves. There was still boyish softness in his face, though his gaze carried the sharpness of someone who noticed more than he let on. At school, he endured taunts about being raised by his aunt, about hand-me-down clothes and an apartment above a shuttered laundromat, but Eli rarely fought back. He saved his fire for smaller, quieter rebellions, small acts that proved he could still choose kindness in a place that taught cruelty early. Neighbors did not hide their disdain. Mrs. Decker, always neat in her silver bob and matching gloves, pulled her purse close when Clara walked past, her lips tightening into lines sharper than any blade. Gary, lean and smirking, who survived on odd jobs and gossip, shook his head when he saw the pair, muttering that their presence embarrassed the block. At church, pews shifted away from Clara as though an inch of wood could protect respectability. She had learned to keep her chin high, but Eli saw it all. Each time his fists curled, his breath grew short, and only Clara's gentle hand on his shoulder reminded him that silence could sometimes guard dignity better than argument. The market sat at the center of Rivertown, a place where food was displayed under buzzing fluorescent lights that made even fresh produce look tired. Clara walked the aisles with the precision of someone who counted each coin twice, picking up potatoes and rice, then sighing when she set a carton of milk back on the shelf. Her coat rustled as she reached for carrots trimmed too close, and she tucked a loaf of day-old bread beneath her arm with care. At the register, Earl the cashier rang her up without meeting her eyes, though he had no trouble glancing at the woman behind her who muttered something about people taking advantage. Clara swallowed the words she wanted to say, lifting her chin by an inch that meant survival. Across the street, beneath the smeared glass of the bus shelter, an old man drifted like a shadow no one wanted to claim. He was in his 70s, with deep lines carved across a face that might once have been kind, but now seemed abandoned by memory. His coat sagged on his frame, buttoned unevenly, cinched at the waist by a piece of frayed rope, and his shoes had collapsed until only socks, threadbare, stained thin against the concrete, protected his feet. His eyes were pale, restless, darting as though chasing a thought that refused to be caught, and his lips trembled with words that never formed. People walked around him, glancing quickly away, and Rivertown had already written its verdict. He was no one, a stray better left ignored. Eli's gaze, however, lingered. He had a habit of tucking away pieces of bread, crusts, or rolls that Clara might otherwise have insisted he finish. Today, from the market's bakery tray, he had slipped a stale roll into his pocket with the quiet desperation of someone carrying a secret mission. Clara, weighed down by groceries and exhaustion, did not notice as Eli edged toward the shelter. The boy's steps slowed as he approached, his hand closing around the roll like it was treasure. And when Harold turned confused eyes toward him, Eli lifted the bread without a word. For a moment, the old man only stared, as if trying to remember how to receive kindness. Then he took it, hands trembling less once they held something meant for him. Clara saw it happen as she left the store. She paused, the grocery bag pressing against her chest, watching her nephew's small rebellion. The old man's face softened, his lips tugging into something like a smile, fragile but real. Around them, passers-by muttered. Mrs. Decker scolded that children should not waste food on strangers. Gary laughed, remarking that feeding strays only made them return. Even Earl, who rarely spoke outside his register, murmured that kindness was wasted here. Their words stung the air, sharp and dismissive. Clara could have stayed silent, but instead she walked across the street and placed her hand gently on Eli's shoulder. Her voice, firm but low, carried farther than anger could. We teach our children what to do with their hands. Mine knows how to open his. The sidewalk fell quiet for a breath, long enough for Eli to look up at his aunt with wide eyes. Clara guided him home, her steps steady though the judgment of the town clung like smoke. Rivertown rehearsed its bitterness all around them, an engine stalling, a woman tugging her child's mitten back on, a man scraping ice from a windshield with a cracked card. Yet Eli talked only about the old man's smile, describing it in crooked shapes as though mapping a constellation. Clara listened, her heart tightening and softening at once, recognizing in his words the very seed of compassion she feared the town would crush. Back in their small apartment above the laundromat, the radiator clattered to life reluctantly, warming the room in uneven breaths. Clara unpacked the groceries, setting out carrots and rice on the chipped table, and Eli begged to peel vegetables because he liked watching the skins curl away. The pot of soup they managed was modest, but its steam filled the air with comfort that felt larger than it was. Clara watched her nephew eat, his face glowing in the weak lamplight, and she thought of the bread he had given away. Outside, Rivertown carried on with its indifference, but inside, Clara felt something rare, a certainty that despite the scorn, dignity still belonged to them, and compassion was a legacy Eli was already learning to carry. Later, while Eli drifted toward sleep, Harold finished the last bite of bread at the bus shelter. His eyes, dulled by confusion, glimmered for a fleeting moment as though touched by memory. He pressed a hand to his chest, searching for something he could not name, while the rest of the town hurried past, uninterested. Clara looked out her window once more before turning off the lamp. The night was cold, but for the first time in many days, she felt warmth that could not be measured in blankets or coins, only in the quiet courage of choosing kindness when no one else would. The cold of Rivertown did not simply settle over the streets that afternoon. It clawed into them, filling every crevice with ice-edged breath, and by the time Clara and Eli turned the corner toward the bus shelter, the day had dimmed to steel. The market was behind them, the last coins already exchanged for bread too small and rice too little, and the quiet between them was heavy with the arithmetic of survival. Yet what waited ahead pierced Clara's heart more than any ledger could. Harold, the old man who had lingered on the margins of their days, now sat shrunken on the bench beneath the cracked glass, his frame folded like paper too many times. His coat was still buttoned, but the fabric had surrendered, its threads unraveling as if they too wanted release, and his trousers sagged over knees that trembled with exhaustion. More than anything, it was his feet that struck Clara. The socks were torn into ribbons, gaping holes bearing raw skin, reddened and cracked from exposure. The wet pavement had marked him cruelly, salt stains circling his ankles, his soles nearly pressed against the frozen ground. The sight pressed into her chest like a stone, and though Clara herself had no more to give than half a pot of thin porridge waiting at home, she knew leaving him there was not a choice at all. Eli shifted uncomfortably, pulling his hoodie tighter, his voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "We barely have enough for us," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the bag of bread in Clara's hand, his words clipped by the frosty air. He thought of the cracked bowls at home, of soup stretched thinner each night, and he clenched his jaw at the image of another mouth joining the table. His worry twisted into resentment, not because he lacked compassion, but because hunger teaches children to guard what little is theirs. Clara heard him, but she didn't stop walking. Instead, she lowered herself beside Harold, knees brushing the icy ground, and spoke with the same calm she had once used to soothe Eli's fever. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying warmth that the wind could not steal, "come with us." Harold looked up, his pale eyes cloudy with confusion, lips parting as if to argue, but no sound followed. When he swayed, Clara steadied him with a hand at his arm, her grip sure and unwavering, and she helped him rise. Eli watched, resentment burning in his chest, yet he could not ignore the image of his aunt, a woman exhausted from her own battles, choosing to shoulder another's burden without hesitation. Together they moved slowly, step by step, Clara guiding Harold with gentle firmness, Eli trailing behind, his heart heavy with contradiction. Inside the apartment the air was little warmer, the radiator coughing as though reluctant to serve, and the smell of damp coats filled the narrow room. Clara eased Harold into the chair with the least wobble and crossed immediately to fetch a basin, filling it with water warmed from the kettle. She unwrapped the socks clinging to his feet, peeling them away as if removing old wounds, and the sight beneath drew a sharp breath even from Eli, the skin raw, cracked open at the heels, bruised from cold. Clara did not recoil. She dipped a cloth into the basin and began to wash, her fingers steady, her expression tender, as though this act were as natural as feeding her nephew or mending his torn sleeves. Eli stood frozen, the sharp protest he had carried dissolving in his throat. He wanted to shout again about food, about scarcity, about how the world took too much from them already. But watching Clara kneel on the rug, cradling Harold's foot with reverence, he felt something shift. It was not guilt alone, but awe, an unfamiliar recognition that strength was not in hoarding, but in giving. Clara dried Harold's feet with the softest towel she owned, slid a pair of mended wool socks over them, and tucked a blanket across his legs, each gesture quiet yet profound. Eli felt the day's bitterness drain from him, replaced by a heat he could neither deny nor name. In the kitchen corner, Clara lifted the lid of their pot, the broth thin, the rice grains sparse, and she ladled portions into 3 bowls. She placed the first in front of Harold, the second before Eli, the third at her place, her own serving barely more than a swallow. Eli stared at the steam rising from his bowl, torn between anger and admiration, and when he glanced up, he saw Harold's trembling hands lift the spoon with care. The old man's eyes fluttered shut after the first sip, his chest easing, his expression softening into gratitude. Eli felt his resentment collapse, replaced by a flush of humility. In that fragile silence, he ate slowly, every mouthful heavy with understanding. The radiator ticked on, protesting but faithful, and Clara's scarf dried over the chair while Harold leaned back, his breathing lengthening with warmth and rest. Clara folded her hands in her lap, her eyes soft, and for a moment the room no longer felt poor. Eli moved closer to her, the earlier defiance gone, and reached for her hand, clutching it with a grip that apologized and admired all at once. She returned the pressure gently, her eyes meeting his, and though no words passed, a new bond was sealed, one that told Eli he was witnessing not just survival, but grace. Outside, Rivertown groaned beneath the weight of winter, windows shuttered, smoke curling from chimneys that belonged to families who had never noticed the kindness unfolding above the laundromat. But within those walls, the world felt changed, not by abundance, but by compassion. Eli sat quietly, watching Harold drift into sleep under Clara's careful tending, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that his aunt's strength was not in defying the town's scorn, but in refusing to let cruelty shape her heart. He lowered his gaze to his half-empty bowl, feeling both ashamed and proud, and in that paradox found a lesson that would not leave him. When night pressed itself against the window panes and the lamp burned low, the 3 of them occupied the same small room, bound not by blood or comfort, but by the fragile thread of mercy. Harold breathed steadily. Clara rested her hand lightly on Eli's shoulder, and Eli leaned into her warmth, silent but awake, learning from every heartbeat beside him. In that moment, the fear of less no longer shadowed him. Instead, He carried the dawning knowledge that enough was not measured by what they had, but by how they chose to give it. Morning arrived in Rivertown with a dull iron light that pressed against the windows like unwelcome news. The chill of the night still lingered in the apartment, clinging to the thin curtains and the worn rug, but Clara rose with practiced quiet, careful not to disturb Eli, who was still curled on the sofa. For a moment she let herself remember the image of Harold resting peacefully in the patched chair, wrapped in the blanket she had tucked around his legs, breathing steadily as if safety had finally allowed him to sleep. But when she turned her gaze toward the chair, it was empty. The blanket was folded neatly at the corner, the pillow smoothed, as though he had vanished in silence, leaving behind only the courtesy of order. Clara stood very still, her hand resting on the edge of the chair. There was no note, no word of thanks, only the evidence of absence, and the faintest trace of warmth had already gone from the fabric. A dozen questions crowded her mind. Where had he gone? Was he safe? Had he remembered his name long enough to find a home? But she asked none of them aloud. Eli stirred, blinking at the chair, then at his aunt, and his expression hardened with the kind of hurt a child disguises as disappointment. He left, Eli whispered, as if the words might shatter something fragile, and Clara nodded once, pressing her lips together until they whitened. By the time they stepped outside, the town already knew. Rivertown had a way of carrying stories faster than wind, twisting them into lessons others never meant to teach. Mrs. Decker was waiting by her stoop, her gloves pulled high as if the chill of gossip could be warded off. "You brought a stray into your home and he slipped away before morning," she said loudly enough for the milkman to pause. "Some people never learn. Can't even provide for a boy, but still collecting burdens like prizes." The words cut not because they were new, but because they confirmed what Clara had endured for years, that kindness was seen as weakness, generosity as foolishness. She met the woman's eyes, swallowed the burn in her throat, and kept walking. Gary leaned against his rusting truck down the block, a grin spreading across his face as if her sorrow were entertainment. "Heard your guest left early," he called out, pretending it's sympathy but dripping with mockery. "Guess even beggars know better than to stick around a sinking ship." His laughter followed them as Clara guided Eli toward the bus stop, her shoulders straight, though her stomach tightened with shame she refused to show. Other neighbors turned their faces, whispering into gloved hands, their smirks sharper than knives. Clara's silence was not defeat but a shield, though Eli's small hands curled into fists, his jaw trembling with the effort of holding back words. At school, the cruelty sharpened into something that no longer disguised itself. The playground was crusted with frost, breath rising from children like smoke, and clusters of boys stood in huddles too loud to be ignored. Eli walked past with his backpack slung low, but the words struck anyway. "There goes the orphan," one boy sneered, his cap pulled low over his blonde hair, his smirk practiced for the audience. Another chimed in, "Raised by a poor old woman who drags her scraps home like a cat with trash. Bet he wishes he had a real family." Their laughter echoed off the brick walls, shrill in the winter air. Eli felt each insult like a stone, and for a moment he wanted to run, to hide behind the safe silence he had built. But then he saw Clara in his mind, kneeling on the rug with Harold's foot in her hands, steady and gentle despite her own hunger. He remembered her folding the blanket with care, not because anyone would see, but because dignity required it. And suddenly the shame he carried turned into fire. Eli turned toward the boys, his voice breaking through the jeers with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. "That woman is my mother," he declared, his tone clear enough to cut through the wind. "And I am proud of her." The words startled even him, but once spoken they felt undeniable, rooted deep in his chest. The playground fell into a hush, the laughter stalling as children turned their eyes toward Eli. The blond boy scoffed, muttering about lies, but his voice had lost its edge, replaced by uncertainty. Another shifted uncomfortably, glancing away as if ashamed of the cruelty he had joined. Eli stood tall, shoulders squared, his breath clouding around him like smoke from a fire that would not be smothered. For the first time, he felt bigger than the insult, larger than the shadow cast by poverty. Pride filled the space where embarrassment had once lived, and though the silence of the other children was not approval, it was enough to steady him. Back at the apartment that evening, Clara moved quietly through the room, her eyes heavy but her movements deliberate. Eli watched her as she set out bowls, reheated the remaining broth, and folded the blanket Harold had left behind. She did not ask about school, and he did not tell her, but when she placed a bowl before him, her hand lingered on his shoulder. For the first time, Eli did not shrink from the weight of her sacrifices. Instead, he lifted his eyes to hers and let the pride he had spoken on the playground live openly in his gaze. Clara saw it, and though she said nothing, her lips curved into the smallest, most resolute smile. The night drew down over Rivertown again, but the room felt different. The chair in the corner was still empty, the blanket still folded, yet the silence no longer carried the sting of absence. It carried something steadier, something Eli could not yet name, a conviction born of seeing his aunt's kindness mocked and finding the courage to defend it. In that small apartment, battered by cold and judgment, they sat together at the table, two souls bound not only by survival, but by the fierce pride of choosing dignity in the face of scorn. The days that followed were marked by whispers Clara pretended not to hear, and a quiet resolve Eli carried like a banner no one else could see. Their apartment above the laundromat settled back into routine, bowls of soup stretched thin, laundry folded with patient hands, evenings lit by a single lamp that flickered when the wind pulled at the wires. Rivertown went on with its small cruelties, neighbors turning their stares into knives, but inside those walls Clara and Eli endured, the memory of Harold folded away with the blanket he had left behind. Neither of them expected that silence to be broken so soon, nor that it would arrive in the form of a polished car gliding down their cracked street like a visitor from another world. It was late afternoon when the black sedan eased to a stop in front of the building, its glossy finish reflecting the dull facades around it, drawing curtains back as neighbors peeked from behind lace. The car door opened with deliberate grace, and from within stepped a man transformed. Harold stood there, no longer the hunched figure in a threadbare coat, but upright, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a silk tie knotted clean at his collar. His silver hair was combed neatly, his shoes shone, and beside him walked a younger man, mid-30s, tall, in a charcoal overcoat and wire-rimmed glasses, holding a leather folio with the calm efficiency of an assistant who had managed schedules and silences alike. The sight was so jarring that Clara, standing by her door with a bag of groceries, nearly let it slip from her hand. The neighbors were less restrained. Mrs. Decker gasped audibly, clutching her gloves as though they might explain the scene, while Gary whistled low, leaning on his truck with new interest. Whispers rippled down the street, judgment temporarily silenced by curiosity. Clara drew Eli close to her side, her heart knocking against her ribs as Harold's eyes lifted and found her. His face softened, his expression carrying recognition deeper than memory, and he stepped forward with the deliberate dignity of a man who had returned not just to a place, but to himself. "Clara," he said, his voice firm yet threaded with gratitude, "my name is Harold Whitmore." The words struck like bells in the cold air, their resonance louder than their volume. He paused, his gaze sweeping the faces watching from porches and windows, then back to her. "I am the heir to the Whitmore Educational Trust, a foundation built to serve those most in need. Months ago, after a stroke, I lost both my memory and my bearings. I wandered, forgotten even to myself, and yet—" His voice thickened, his eyes brightened with unshed tears. "You opened your home when no one else would, and in your kindness I began to remember who I was." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but words clung stubbornly to her tongue. Around them the street held its breath, the same mouths that had called her foolish now parted in astonishment. The assistant adjusted his folio, watching with professional detachment, but even he glanced at Clara with a respect that made her shift her weight. Eli, pressed against her side, stared with wide eyes, unable to reconcile the dignified figure before him with the shivering man whose feet his aunt had washed on their rug. It was Harold who bridged the distance. His gaze fell on Eli, and for a moment his composure faltered, emotion carving lines deeper into his face. He stepped closer, lowering himself slightly to the boy's height, and his voice trembled with recognition. "You," he whispered, almost reverently. "You're the boy who gave me bread at the market. That crust of kindness carried me farther than you will ever know." Eli froze, his mouth opening in surprise, and then, slowly, he nodded. His cheeks flushed with the mix of pride and disbelief, and in that instant the thin thread of their earlier encounter braided itself into something unbreakable. The moment hung in the air, binding past to present, small gesture to grand revelation. Neighbors leaned closer to their windows, straining to capture the significance they did not fully understand. Clara placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, grounding him, though her own knees felt unsteady. Harold straightened, brushing at his sleeve, but his eyes lingered on them both, his gratitude too vast to fit inside the polished composure he wore. "It was not the institutions or wealth that brought me back," he continued, voice clear now. "It was humanity." "Yours," Gary shifted uncomfortably at his truck, and Mrs. Decker's lips pursed as if struggling against the weight of her own disbelief. For once, their judgment had no place to land. Clara inclined her head, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, though her heart raced with the enormity of what had been revealed. The assistant checked his watch discreetly, then looked to Harold for direction, but Harold shook his head, unwilling to rush what mattered. Eli finally found his voice. "I just didn't want you to be hungry," he said, almost apologetically. Harold smiled, a weary yet radiant smile, and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "And that," he replied, "was enough to remind me I was still alive." The words, simple and unadorned, struck deeper than any speech could. Clara blinked back tears, her arm tightening protectively around Eli, and for the first time in months, the silence of Rivertown felt less like condemnation and more like awe. The car waited, gleaming at the curb, its engine purring softly, but Harold lingered. He looked again at Clara, then at Eli, and in his expression was a vow unspoken, the promise that what had begun in hunger and despair had unfolded into something larger, something destined. The air held a weight that was neither cold nor cruel, but alive with possibility, and for Clara, who had endured so much scorn, the recognition was almost too much to bear. She lowered her gaze for a moment, steadying herself, then looked back at Harold with the same quiet strength she had shown the night she brought him home. Inside the apartment above the laundromat, the blanket still lay folded, the chair still bore the ghost of Harold's rest, but now the past and present converged at Clara's doorstep. A woman's compassion, a boy's crust of bread, an old man's forgotten name. All of it had led here, to this afternoon, where truth revealed itself not in grandeur, but in the quiet acknowledgement that even the smallest act of mercy can alter the course of a life. And as neighbors whispered behind their windows, Clara and Eli stood together, their dignity intact, while Harold Whitmore, restored and resolute, bowed his head slightly in thanks. The black sedan had long since rolled away, yet the weight of Harold Whitmore's visit lingered in Rivertown like a bell that would not stop ringing. Neighbors who had once muttered behind their curtains now found themselves whispering in awe, their certainty unsettled by the revelation that the man Clara sheltered was not a vagrant, but a philanthropist whose name was etched into plaques and scholarships across the state. For Clara, the day had ended as it always did, with dishes to wash and Eli's books to check, but beneath the ordinary rhythms was a current of change she could neither deny nor entirely trust. She did not expect Harold to return so soon, nor that he would bring with him not pity but promise. A week later, he arrived again, this time without spectacle. The suit remained, though softer in fabric, and his gait carried both the steadiness of recovery and the humility of a man determined not to forget where he had been. He sat at Clara's worn table with Eli perched nearby, and in that small room he laid out documents more valuable than any jewel. "For Eli," Harold said gently, sliding forward papers embossed with the seal of the state. "Comprehensive medical coverage, no waiting lists, no bills hidden under doors. His care is secured, as it always should have been." Clara's hand trembled as she touched the edge of the papers, her lips parting without words. Eli, wide-eyed, looked between them, understanding only that something impossible had been made safe. Harold was not finished. He opened the leather folio his assistant carried and revealed architectural sketches of a low, wide building with windows that welcomed light and halls that invited gathering. "A community center," Harold explained, his eyes steady on Clara's, "here in Rivertown. A place for children to learn, for families to find shelter, for hands to find work and purpose. And I would like you, Clara, to manage it. You know this town. You know what it needs." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the radiator. Clara stared at the lines on the page, the echo of every insult she had endured colliding with the possibility that those same streets might one day speak her name with respect. The months that followed were heavy with labor. Construction crews arrived, their trucks rattling down streets unaccustomed to such attention. At first, Rivertown's residents remained wary. Mrs. Decker muttered that no building can change people, and Gary scoffed that charity projects collapse like cardboard in the rain. Even as walls rose and paint brightened the corners, suspicion clung to Clara like a second coat. She walked the site daily, speaking with workers, ensuring every board was set firm, her coat patched but her steps resolute. To the curious eyes that lingered, she offered no arguments, only the quiet persistence of someone who understood that proving worth was not in words but in work. When the doors of the Rivertown Community Center finally opened, the air inside smelled of new wood and fresh paint. Rows of books lined the modest library, donated toys filled the playroom, and in the kitchen, volunteers prepared meals meant for any who arrived hungry. Clara stood at the entrance in a simple dress, her hair tied back, welcoming each neighbor as if they had always belonged. Children rushed past her into the bright rooms, their laughter echoing against the fresh walls, and slowly the grown faces softened, suspicion bending toward gratitude. Even Mrs. Decker lingered longer than she admitted, watching her grandson trace letters on a chalkboard, while Gary found himself returning on cold nights for a warm meal and the dignity of conversation. Clara's role deepened with each passing season. She organized reading circles for children whose parents worked late shifts, taught sewing to women who had been told they had nothing left to offer, and guided men once broken by unemployment toward jobs mending what others had abandoned. She kept the doors open even when storms howled, her scarf wrapped tight and her voice steady as she told each visitor, "This place is yours as much as mine." Rivertown, which had once turned away from her, now began to lean toward her light. Yet Clara never sought recognition. Her satisfaction came in the sparkle of children's eyes, the softened shoulders of the weary, and the knowledge that no one would be left shivering in the cold as Harold once had. Eli grew in the glow of this transformation. He shed the hunched posture of a boy bracing for insults and walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. At school, he no longer hid when questions turned personal. Instead, when classmates asked about his family, he met their eyes and said clearly, "My mother taught me something money can never buy, compassion." His words silenced laughter and stirred admiration, his voice carrying the weight of truth, earned through hardship. Where once he had been mocked as the boy with nothing, now he was respected as the boy who understood everything that mattered. The center flourished year after year. Harvest festivals were held in its courtyard, snow shelters opened in its gymnasium, and summer programs kept children's hands busy with art and song. Clara guided it all with the same steady patience she had shown when mending socks and stirring thin soup, her strength quiet but undeniable. People began to speak her name differently, not with scorn, but with respect, and though she never asked for it, she became the anchor of Rivertown. To some, she was still just Clara, the woman who lived above the laundromat, but to most, she had become something rarer, the silent hero who had turned scorn into service. One evening, years later, Eli returned from school with taller shoulders and a steadier voice, finding Clara in the community center's office surrounded by papers and children's drawings taped to the walls. "They asked me today about role models," he said, setting his bag down. "I told them about you. I told them my mother taught me compassion, and that's something no amount of money could ever buy." Clara paused, her hands resting on the desk, and looked at him, her eyes shining not with pride but with gratitude. She had not lived to be admired, but to see that her lessons had rooted in him was more than she had ever dreamed. Outside the windows, the town carried on, its streets still cracked, its winters still sharp, but the air was different now. Children raced past the community center's doors without fear. Elders found chairs waiting for them by the fire, and the same neighbors who once turned away now nodded with respect. Clara moved through it all with quiet grace, not as a woman transformed by fortune, but as one who had revealed what had always been within her: resilience, mercy, and an unshakable belief that no soul was beyond saving. Rivertown had once named her outcast, now it carried her name as its keeper. In the end, this is not only the story of Clara, It is the story of every person who keeps moving forward with quiet strength, even when the world tries to push them aside. It is about those who reach out a hand to help without waiting for reward, who give bread to the hungry and dignity to the forgotten. Such people remind us that compassion is stronger than wealth, and that true courage is found in the simple choice to care. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you are thinking and what compassion means to you. Subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more stories that honor silent heroes. And may God bless every listener who carries kindness in their heart and lives with the strength to lift others along the way.